Okay, welcome everybody to, I believe it's our 13th meeting for Society of the Spectacle. And we read the first 4 chapters of it and then took a 2-session film break to watch Debord's movie of the book. And then last time we got back to it, chapter 5, and we got most of the way through chapter 5. So this time we have a little bit left of chapter 5 and the rather short chapter 6. So we'll probably get through those both today. Anyway, I think all of you here already know where we're coming from and who Debord is and everything. So I'm going to start reading where we left off, which is thesis number 139. This is the chapter called Time and History, and the previous things have been going through ancient history and so on, and we've got up to the Renaissance now. The Renaissance was a joyous break with eternity. Though seeking its heritage and legitimacy in the ancient world, it represented a new form of historical life. Its irreversible time was that of a never-ending accumulation of knowledge, and the historical consciousness engendered by the experience of democratic communities and of the forces that destroy them now took up once again with Machiavelli the analysis of secularized power, saying the previously unsayable about the state. When he says took up once again, he's referring back to Greece, which was sort of the first time anybody had undertaken a somewhat objective analysis of how does power work, like with Aristotle and people like that sort of debating and this. So in
I'm sorry, Ken. What thesis number are we at right now?
number 139. Um, so with Machiavelli, who of course wrote The Prince and also many other political analyses, we have this very disillusioned, unillusioned look at how social systems or political systems work. Up till him, practically everything that was written about government or politics was very ruling class oriented. You know, it was just treatises on that the ruler should do such and such. A good ruler will do this and so, and there's really no examination about, well, how did that ruler get there in the first place, and why should people paying any attention to him, and so on. So with Machiavelli, you get that utterly hardcore analysis saying the previously unsayable about the state, namely that it's just raw power struggles. In the exuberant life of the Italian cities, in the creation of festivals, life is experienced as an enjoyment of the passage of time. But this enjoyment of transience is itself transient. The song of Lorenzo de' Medici, who is one of the rulers of Florence, which Burckhardt considered the very spirit of the Renaissance, unquote, is the eulogy of this fragile historical festival, delivers on itself. Quote, how beautiful the spring of life and how quickly it vanishes, unquote. 140. The constant tendency toward the monopolization of historical life by the absolute monarchist state, a transitional form on the way to complete domination by the bourgeois class, brings into clear view the nature of the bourgeoisie's new type of irreversible time. Now, this is something that might at first seem a little odd because he's talking about things like Louis XIV's France, where Louis XIV, of course, there had been kings before him, but he ends up having this really supreme power, partly by reducing the power of the nobility and all that. So it's just sort of the king and then everybody else, and not the king being rivals of dukes and counts and so on. So Debord is saying that at the same time, that might seem, well, that's the supreme monarchist thing. Debord is saying actually that's on the way to the rule of the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie would have a much harder time to rule if you have this whole feudal class of lords and landowners and so on in the way. But if that class can be sort of drained of its power and it all goes to the king, it kind of centralizes and concentrates power. And then the bourgeoisie can actually ally with the king against those feudal rivals. And they can see themselves, okay, this king is helping us out. He's getting rid of this extraneous stuff with all these landlords and tax, this stuff. So, well, it looks like its power is moving up to this monarchical thing. Actually, Debord is pointing out the actual fact, there's no question about this, that the bourgeoisie is becoming more powerful at the same time. I mean, they may have a humble appearance, but they are the ones that are loaning the king money when he needs it to pay his soldiers or to do whatever and so on. So little by little, the bourgeoisie is, so that's what this thesis is about. The bourgeoisie is associated with labor time, which has finally been freed from cyclical time. With the bourgeoisie, work becomes work that transforms historical conditions. The bourgeoisie is the first ruling class for which work is of value. And the bourgeoisie, which suppresses all privilege and recognizes no value that does not stem from the exploitation of labor, has appropriately identified its own value as a ruling class with labor and has made the progress of labor the measure of its own progress. The class that accumulates commodities and capital continually modifies nature by modifying labor itself, by unleashing labor's productivity. At the stage of absolute monarchy, all social life was already concentrated within the ornamented poverty of the court, the gaudy trappings of a bleak state administration, whose apex was the, quote, profession of king, unquote. People called Louis XIV. They said, what's different people's role? And I said, oh, his career is king. He's his profession is king. All particular historical freedoms had to surrender to this new power. The free play of the feudal lords' irreversible time came to an end in their last lost battles, in the Fronde and in the Scottish uprising in support of Charles Edward. That's Bonnie Prince Charlie. The world now had a new foundation. So those two instances there, the Fronde and the Scottish uprising trying to reinstall Prince Charles, both failed dramatically. But Debord is looking at that and he's sort of seeing, okay, these are kind of the last times where you can see the nobles playing with history, playing with power, playing the game of, yay, our good, we're going to do this. And in both cases, they're defeated by the respective monarchs, and the monarch's power is drawing more and more from the bourgeoisie who's defeating them. So after then, you don't have much credibility of the nobles, even though the nobles still exist. So 141, the victory of the bourgeoisie is the victory of a profoundly historical time. because it is the time corresponding to an economic production that continuously transforms society from top to bottom. As long as agrarian production remains the predominant form of labor, the cyclical time that remained at the base of society reinforced the joint forces of tradition, which tended to hold back any historical movement. But the irreversible time of the bourgeois economy eradicates those vestiges throughout the world. History, which until then had seemed to involve only the actions of individual members of the ruling class, and which had thus been recorded as a mere chronology of events, is now understood as a general movement, a relentless movement that crushes any individuals in its path, including even kings or nobles. By discovering its basis in political economy, history becomes aware of what had previously been unconscious. But this basis remains unconscious because it cannot be brought to light. This blind prehistory, this new fate that no one controls, is the only thing that the commodity economy has democratized. 142. The history that is present in all the depths of society tends to become invisible at the surface. The triumph of irreversible time is also its metamorphosis into a time of things, because its victory was brought about by the mass production of objects in accordance with the laws of the commodity. The main product that economic development has transformed from a luxurious rarity to a commonly consumed item is thus history itself, but only in the form of the history of the abstract movement of things that dominates all qualitative aspects of life. While the earlier cyclical time had supported an increasing degree of historical time lived by individuals and groups, the irreversible time of production tends to socially eliminate such lived time. So I'm going to stop there. Questions or comments? You can raise your digital hand or write a question in the chat. And Kim, you can keep an eye on the chat and let me know if there's any things there. So Sid, unmute yourself.
So, so this whole section on time is kind of challenging for me, and there's a lot of talk about history and irreversible time and history, and like in 140, it says. The bourgeoisie is associated with labor time, which has finally been freed from cyclical time. With the bourgeoisie, work becomes work that transforms historical conditions, which, I don't quite get it. I mean, I sort of was wondering, like, since Debord refers to Marx a lot, and in this group, there's people who bring that up. Like I think Mike talks about Marx a lot. And I read stuff in Marx when I was in college, a million years ago. But I don't feel like I'm, really an expert in that or have read a lot of the things. So would it be easier to understand all this if one kind of knew about Marx? I mean, the whole question of historical time and the movement of history, and I don't quite understand.
Yeah, I mean, a simple answer of your last thing there is yes, it would be easier. Debord is, he's not assuming that everybody knows Marx, but he's going on the basis, like Marx has written essays and books about these topics. And so to some extent, Debord will be recapitulating what Marx comes up with. And some of Marx may be questionable. Other of Marx's things maybe, well, this is pretty definite, folks. I mean, if you are aware of history at all, you're aware of some of these things. So there may be various things that Debord is saying, and Debord is not necessarily agreeing with Marx in every detail, but he is picking up on certain general things, like for sure, Marx would be saying very similar things that Debord is saying in this chapter. But in this chapter, Debord is treating it from the angle of time. And Marx talks about things about time and history, of course, a lot, but maybe he never did exactly that particular take on it. So there's going to be some new things from Debord, and there's going to be other things that are just sort of like Marx, but sort of looked at from a little different slant. And in many cases, when you look at Marx from a little different slant, you find that he's still accurate, even though Marx himself might not have said exactly that same thing. So certainly Marx, looking at the difference between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and then the bourgeois revolution, that kind of period there, uh, would have uh, would have known exactly what Debord is talking about here. And I think would have just agreed completely, said, oh, that would be an interesting way of putting that. To get to some of your earlier things, so when it says the bourgeoisie is making time a quality, like a value, he's pointing out that the nobles never did that. The nobles had their serfs and so on like that, and no noble ever went around talking about how great work was and that was the the foundation of society. They're talking about how great they were because they, ordained by God and they're superior people, and these other people are supposed to, they're just grubbing along at the bottom there, and they're supposed to feel privileged that the nobles take care of them and defend them in case somebody invades. There was no noble that said, oh, we're all one big happy family here and work is great.
Right,
You never saw a noble saying, oh, I'll get out here and do a little healthy work or something.
right.
Uh, so anyway, the reason that they didn't do that was not only because of the ideology, which said that that stuff is low, and other things are noble, like war or something, but also because uh, as it didn't go with their, the ideology that was keeping them in power was that there were these superior people
Right,
kind of
right.
magically above the. Okay, well, the bourgeoisie comes along and they hire escaped serfs that come to the towns and get free. And they say when they hire those people, they're on this theoretically equal train. The bourgeoisie is not a noble. He can't order the peasant around. He's
Mhm.
not saying I'm superior, so you have to work for me. He's just saying, I happen to own this property here, and I've got this money. And if you come along here and do this stuff for me, I'll give you X amount of money, or I'll give you room and board, or whatever the thing may be. And see, the nobles never did that. A king
Right.
never said, "Oh, let's make a deal here and get it turned down." Whereas the peasant could turn that down,
So,
and he can say, "Go to hell, rich guy. I don't want that. I've got a good job over here." And the
so
noble couldn't do any. I mean, the rich guy couldn't do anything about it.
so is that what they're referring to when they say that's the beginning of history, like real history?
Well, no, because I mean, there has been history before, but the history before, as noted in that number 41, 141, I think, is saying before then, the history not only appeared, but practically was these rulers who were deciding things, and the peasants and everybody else just sort of had to go along with it. They didn't have any stake in it or whatever. Now, what happens is that the uh, sort of primitive capitalist, he's a sort of capitalist. The bourgeoisie just means that originally just means a city dweller, but it came to mean a person who had some money that could hire, you know. So that person is now hiring people to make things for him, or maybe he's hiring them to be a sailor on a ship to go trade and, you know, whatever. But he's doing that in order to make money, which then can be reinvested and make more money, you know, to hire more people, et cetera, et cetera. And unbeknownst to himself, that capitalist or that burger uh, is actually changing things, because when he starts hiring a bunch of people, you know, in one workshop, then the way that work works is different than on a farm or something. You know, they start inventing new little gadgets to make it go, you know, faster, or make it more, make the product better so it will sell more likely, you know, et cetera. And it becomes more systematic. Whereas the nobles were never systematic about that. They didn't give a shit. You know, they just bossed everybody around and hoped that they would get some pillage out of it, or something.
Well, that
So
makes sense.
yeah, go ahead.
Well, yeah, that totally makes sense to me, Ken. The thing that, I guess the thing that I'm sort of choking on at some level is the word history. It's like, because there's cyclical time, and then there's prehistory, and then there's somehow irreversible time, which to me means, okay, so it's not reversing. So there's this progression of history, which is what the progression of what's happening now kind of thing. Is that what they're meaning when they
Well,
say
the
history?
original irreversible time goes back thousands of years, but that irreversible time is only kind of on the surface. There is a progress or change from one dynasty to another, for example, or from one, you know, when Greece rebuffed Persia, that was a big deal. And then that influenced Rome. And when Rome did this, it influenced, you know, the Middle Ages and so on. So there's definitely things start moving forward, which is reflected in the semi-historical religions like Christianity and Islam, you know, that you're going from point A to point B. You're not just going around in a circle for infinite, all that. So when we get to the Renaissance, we've gotten over that serfdom kind of stuff. They're still nobles, but there's starting to be more competition from the bourgeoisie and the workers. Not that the workers are doing that much, but the workers are kind of linked with the bourgeoisie as a different kind of economy, different kind of production. Whether they like it or know about it or not, they're doing new things. They're discovering new countries, they're importing new things, they're making new inventions, all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
And when they do that, it's like the irreversible time is kicking in more. I mean, there's always there's been some history, but now you have things where more people have something to do with that. Like when you get to the English Revolution of 1640s and 50s, uh, they may still be talking about religious and, you know, the second coming is going to do this and this is how God wants it or something. But what's happening is that you've got lots of people making history, and those people making history, a lot of them are small businessmen, or they're you know, kind of what's the case, you know, crafts people or something like that. Or they're little independent farmers. They're not serfs. You know, so it starts being people that are of a little more secular mind. They have more of a sense, well, this is worth that, you know, whereas the peasant economy, you know, it's like that hardly enters into anything. But with this, you can buy something, you can lose a lot of money, you can cheat people in different ways. You can develop a business, you can expand, you can make deals, you can have banks and conglomerates, you know, where different capitalists band together to buy a ship to go over here, and so it's like a stock company. It's like the stock exchange to minimize potentials if the ship goes down. They're all tied in there. So they've got insurance, for example. If the ship goes down, then the insurance people are making money. You have all these different things going on that didn't used to exist. And when those things go on, they're still kings and nobles, but the kings and nobles, little by little, find themselves in this somewhat different world where this unnoble person has $1 billion, and and they can't, sometimes they just try to steal it, but realistically, for the economy to run, they can't just go around and have people making money and then they just steal it. That's the society doesn't function when so they have to plead practically the king to please loan me money. I desperately need it. We're in a war now, or I want to build this thing over here now. And then these people are making some good interest out of that. And so, and little by little, the kings are not the richest people around, or let alone the nobles. A lot of them may be going broke.
So is that the beginning of what Debord and Marx are calling history?
Well, we have different kinds of history, but this is the beginning of what you might say economic history, where the people who deal with the economy, either the people who own it or the people who are part of it being exploited by it, like the workers or intermediate middlemen or something like this, they are the ones that are doing stuff. And the nobles are just kind of coasting along for a ride. They may still think that they're the top dogs, but slowly over the centuries, they find that their castle is mortgaged or something. And so little by little, those people who have no claim to rule, they are not nobles. They're just rich and they own stuff. Little by little, they come to power. And then something like the French Revolution comes along, and it looks very dramatic. They're overthrowing, they're cutting off the king's head and executing nobles and all that. But basically, they were already in control. It's just that made it visible. They were already dominating the king and so on. And to the extent, like Marx again always plays on this, that underneath it all, they were, and Debord also is saying, they were already the ruling class, but in a sort of subtle way. It wasn't visible. You could still think that the king was in charge. After this is over, you can't think the king is in charge because they've executed him. And so then you actually have the bourgeoisie in charge. And then we get into a whole other thing there because the bourgeoisie is pretending it's the people. I think we better go on from there, but thanks. It's a good question, and we will continue to. Ed? Yeah,
Just
go ahead.
maybe, yeah, I'm willing, I'm fine letting it go because it seems like in later ones in 142, like last paragraph or
Yeah.
last, and in 143, the last sentence, there's sort of mention of historical time, and maybe somebody else, has thoughts about that too.
Yeah. Ed?
Thank you, by the way.
Could I just intervene just one
Okay.
word about Louis XIV
Uh-huh.
and the high maintenance that he required of the nobility to be present at Versailles, and the very, very high interest rate that people were paying to the bourgeoisie so as to be able to afford all this finery. It was very expensive. Everybody was getting in debt, just like we are now.
Thank
So,
you. Yes.
all I have to say. Thanks.
Thanks. Ed, stress.
turn off the mic. Hi, well, I, this shouldn't take long. I was struck by the fact that it seemed as though I'm having a hard time moving this around. It seemed as though the the king was on the peasants' side when uh you know he got rid of the nobles,
Right.
and then I think that was in 140. I couldn't find it, but anyway, we talked about it. And then in 141, or maybe it is 140, um, the bourgeoisie, which are kind of like a middle class, middle between, they're not the nobles, but they're kind of the descendants. I mean, they're in the middle, basically. Those guys are on the peasant side or the proletariat side against the king. So is that so the proletariat benefited both by the king getting rid of the nobles and the bourgeoisie getting modifying or getting rid of, taking the place of the king. Is
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah. So there were two things going on there, as you say. Uh, Most of the lower classes would have identified with the king, and if uh, before the French Revolution, there was a time there uh, where I won't go into it, but there was sort of a poll taken of the country, like, tell us what your concerns are.
yeah.
And people went or filled in these things, and a lot of their concerns would be things like the king should stop the nobles from doing blah blah blah. The king should change the taxes so that nobles, they're assuming that that's how you would change it. And so they're relating with the king, like who they're hoping he will be their implementer of these things. And then it goes a little bit later, and then the king, there's contradictions going on here. And so then, yes, the bourgeoisie ends up executing the king, but it took a while. It was after the king
Well, I
sort
see.
of
That was a,
uh, disillusioned people by trying to escape and, you know, all that. So eventually, the bourgeoisie executes the king. So now it's just, and they've gotten rid of the nobles. Now it's just the bourgeoisie and the rest of the population.
mm-hmm,
And at that point, or a little in the following century, the rest of the population
mm-hmm.
starts perceiving like what the bourgeoisie is saying, hey, we're all together here. They say, well, wait a minute. They're the ones that are exploiting us, and if we try to do this, they shoot us down and all that. So anyway,
So, so what happened to the people that actually were the nobles? I
a
don't
lot
think
of
they
them got
joined.
killed. Several thousand of them got their heads cut off, and the
Yep.
remainder ones left the country, most of them, and they left the country. And so for the next 25 years or so, they were exiles. And so they weren't even in the picture. The ones that stayed in the country got executed. And then it was only with the overthrow of Napoleon that there was a restoration, but that didn't last that long. Okay, Dave Blake.
It seemed to me, in answer to Zach's question, that the important thing for me was to understand, at least as I saw it, that what Debord is doing is trying to recategorize the notion, three different notions of time, in order to illuminate their differences. And they're really three totally different things to him. We tend to think of time as a continuum. Yesterday, today, tomorrow, it's all one thing. But he wants to say there are three distinct things. And one of them he calls irreversible time. Irreversible time, I believe, is just another word for the past. The past is what you cannot change, and that's why it's irreversible. The future you cannot change because it doesn't exist. It hasn't happened yet. There's nothing you can do in the future. The present is the place of action where you can make history. So I think that's all he's doing with irreversible time. And if you just, when you substitute the word past for it, you'll understand what Debord is after.
Okay. Well, yeah, time is very difficult to talk about, as we know. Anyway,
it's not a continuum. He doesn't want us to think of it anymore as a continuum.
Well, yeah, I think it will be simpler if we move on. I think that the more that we get into it, I think you'll get a little better idea of these different kinds. So,
Ken, can I just
yes, Kim.
jump in and say, so agrarian production equals cyclical time, and irreversible time is the bourgeois economy. So he's trying to make a distinction between these two modes of production, feudalism and capitalism.
Right. So there's definitely that. But at each stage, there are some of the same types of relations come back. Okay, got some more people here. Zach.
Farmer
No,
town.
I think just elaborating a little bit, my take on this is that cyclical time, which is essentially agrarian time, medieval time, there's no progress. Things are the way they are. They stay the way they are. There's an annual cycle which is unchanging, and then irreversible time is now all of a sudden there are new forces in control. There is forward progress, whether for better or for worse. But there is the sense that history is changing, and it is changing in ways that cannot be reversed because these new factors are coming into play, and it's associated with the new idea of progress, which didn't exist previously.
Yeah, I think that's quite right. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to continue here. So, 143. The bourgeoisie has thus made irreversible historical time known, and it has imposed it on society, but has prevented society from using it. Quote, once there was history, but not anymore, unquote. That's from a Marx Engels text. Because the class of owners of the economy, which is inextricably tied to economic history, must repress every other irreversible use of time because it is directly threatened by them all. The ruling class, made up of specialists in the possession of things, who are themselves therefore possessed by things, is forced to link its fate with the preservation of this reified history, that is, with the preservation of a new immobility within history. Meanwhile, the worker at the base of society is for the first time not materially estranged from history, because the irreversible movement is now generated from that base. By demanding to live the historical time that it produces, the proletariat discovers the simple, unforgettable core of its revolutionary project. And each previously defeated attempt to carry out this project represents a possible point of departure for a new historical life. 144. The irreversible time of the bourgeoisie that had just seized power in French Revolution was at first called by its own name and assigned an absolute origin, year 1 of the Republic. After the king was executed and it was like officially we're a republic, the leaders of that time came up with this idea, like, what are we doing with this Christian, dating everything from Jesus? Let's start fresh. I mean, it was a pretty bold, almost megalomaniac thing. We were going to start from now where we first liberated ourselves completely. And that was in September something, 1992, or I forget when it was. So at that point, they said, we're going to have a new year now. We're going to start from that day, and then they changed the calendar so that each year was 365 days, or 360, I think, with a 5-day vacation sort of thing at the end or whatever. And they changed the names of the seasons, and I think they wanted to change the things into 10 days instead of 7 days or something. Anyway, they actually changed the calendar, and that stayed changed for about 15 years until Napoleon eventually went back to the Christian calendar. That's what's being talked about here. But the revolutionary ideology of general freedom that had served to overthrow the last remnants of a myth-based ordering of values, along with all the traditional forms of social control, was already unable to completely conceal the real goal that it had draped in Roman costume: unrestricted freedom of trade. When he says the Roman costume, it's like these guys like Robespierre and Danton and all that were envisaging themselves as if they were ancient Romans before the Roman Empire, like the ancient Roman Republic. That was their sort of, and so there were statues of people in Roman togas, that were a statue of Robespierre, or they're kind of making that role. But then it turns out that freedom that, turns out to be just freedom for the rich people to make more money, freedom of trade, you don't get taxed and so on. Commodity society, discovering its need to restore the passivity that it had so profoundly shaken in order to establish its own unchallenged rule, now found that for its purposes, quote, Christianity, with its cult of man in the abstract, is the most fitting form of religion, unquote. That's from Marx's Capital. The bourgeoisie thus entered into a compromise with that religion, a compromise also reflected in its presentation of time. The revolutionary calendar was abandoned, and irreversible time returned to the straitjacket of a duly extended Christian era. 145. With the development of capitalism, irreversible time has become globally unified. Universal history becomes a reality because the entire world is brought under the sway of this time's development. But this history that is everywhere simultaneously the same is as yet nothing but an intra-historical rejection of history. What appears the world over as the same day is merely the time of economic production, time cut up into equal abstract fragments. This unified, irreversible time is the time of the global market, and thus also the time of the global spectacle. The irreversible time of production is first of all the measure of commodities. The time officially recognized throughout the world as the general time of society actually only reflects the specialized interests that constitute it, and thus is merely one particular type of time. We're going to go right into the next chapter is about that particular type of time, which is called spectacular time. The epigraph is by Balthazar Gracian, a Renaissance Spanish guy. We have nothing of our own except time, which even the homeless can experience. So the first of that new chapter, 147, the time of production, commodified time, is an infinite accumulation of equivalent intervals. It is irreversible time made abstract, in which each segment need only demonstrate by the clock its purely quantitative equality with all the others. It has no reality apart from its exchangeability. Under the social reign of commodified time, quote, time is everything, man is nothing. He is at most the carcass of time. That's from another Marx then. This devalued time is the complete opposite of time as terrain of human development. That's another phrase by Marx where he's referring to a sort of full holistic kind of time in which you would develop. which you could grow and so on, as opposed to time that's just this little abstract X minutes of this, which are worth X dollars. This general time of human non-development also has a complementary aspect, a consumable form of time based on the present mode of production and manifesting itself in everyday life as a pseudo-cyclical time. This pseudo-cyclical time is in fact merely a consumable disguise of the production system's commodified time. It exhibits the latter's essential traits: homogeneous, exchangeable units, and suppression of any qualitative dimension. But as a byproduct of commodified time, whose function is to promote and maintain the backwardness of everyday life, it is loaded with pseudo-valorizations and manifests itself as a succession of pseudo-individualized moments. Always here, he's talking about this pseudo-cyclical time, this phony time, this commodified time. So we remember the old cyclical time was like agrarian, or even before then, something that went around, and just repeated all this. So now it's saying that in our time, we are stuck in these sort of little cycles too, but they're sort of artificial. The annual thing there was nothing artificial about that. It got colder in the winter and then hotter in the summer, and the crops went this way, and then they were harvested, and all that kind of thing. It was natural that people would go along with that and think, oh, that just keeps going on. But we're going in this stuff that does not inherently have to be that way. There's no reason that we have to have week of work and then a weekend, and then a week of work and a weekend, or that it's 5 days and then 2 days, or whatever it might be, or that vacations come once a year or whatever. Pseudo-cyclical time is associated with the consumption of modern economic survival, the augmented survival in which everyday experience is cut off from decision-making and subjected no longer to the natural order, but to the pseudo-nature created by alienated labor. It is thus quite natural that this unnatural thing echoes the old cyclical rhythm that governed survival in pre-industrial societies, incorporating the natural vestiges of cyclical time, while generating new variants, namely day and night, work and weekend, periodic vacations. And there would be other little things, like in a game, it's yours play and then time out. And then there's a lot of different things in our society, but the most important one is the work. There's work time, and then when you're off work, suddenly you're an adult again. But while you work, you're a temporary slave. And so you keep oscillating behind those things. Pseudo-cyclical time is a time that has been transformed by industry. The time based on commodity production is itself a consumable commodity, one that recombines everything that the disintegration of the old unitary societies had differentiated into private life, economic life, political life. The entire consumable time of modern society ends up being treated as a raw material for various new products put on the market as socially controlled uses of time. Quote, it's quoting from Capital, a product that already exists in a form suitable for consumption may nevertheless serve as raw material for some other product, unquote. And here's an example of this. In its most advanced sectors, concentrated capitalism, which is where we are, is increasingly tending to market fully equipped blocks of time, tending to each functioning as a unified commodity, combining a variety of other commodities. And we have numerous examples of that. You buy a vacation and then everything's covered. you may be actually buying 100 different commodities, but it's just all in one package. And the person who packages it is the one who's making the profit, so on. In the expanding economy of, quote, services and leisure activities, the payment for these blocks of time is equally unified. Quote, everything's included, unquote, whether it's a matter of spectacular living environments, touristic pseudo travel, subscriptions to cultural consumption, or even the sale of sociability itself in the form of exciting conversations and meetings with celebrities. Unquote. Spectacular commodities of this type, which would obviously never sell were it not for the increasing impoverishment of the realities they parody, just as obviously reflect the modernization of sales techniques by being payable on credit. Consumable pseudo-cyclical time is spectacular time, both in the narrow sense as time spent consuming images, and in the broader sense as image of the consumption of time. The time spent consuming images which in turn serve to publicize all the other commodities, is both the particular terrain where the spectacle's mechanisms are most fully implemented, and the general goal that those mechanisms present, the focus and epitome of all particular consumptions. Thus, the time that modern society is constantly seeking to save by increasing transportation speeds or using packaged soups ends up being spent by the American population in watching television 3 to 6 hours a day. As for the social image of the consumption of time, it is exclusively dominated by leisure time and vacations, moments portrayed, like all spectacular commodities, at a distance and as desirable by definition. These commodified moments are explicitly presented as moments of real life, whose cyclical return we are supposed to look forward to. But all that is really happening is that the spectacle is displaying and reproducing itself at a higher level of intensity. What is presented as true life turns out to be merely a more truly spectacular life. Although the present age presents its time to itself as a series of frequently recurring festivities, it is an age that knows nothing of real festivals. The moments within cyclical time, when members of a community join together in a luxurious expenditure of life, are impossible for a society that lacks both community and luxury. Its vulgarized pseudo-festivals are parodies of real dialogue and gift-giving. They may incite waves of excessive economic spending, but they lead to nothing but disillusionments, which can be compensated only by the promise of some new disillusion to come. The less use value is present in the time of modern survival, the more highly it is exalted in the spectacle. The reality of time has been replaced by the publicity of time. So I think we can pause there. Questions or comments?
What does that mean, the publicity of time?
Well, to really have time would be that you were in a time and place and society where you could do something with it. You could enjoy it. You could use it to develop yourself. You could use it to relate to people, these kind of things. But in our society, although we can do those things, most of those things, as we do them, are pretty limited or alienated. So, for example, in a real time, which would be, I'm talking in kind of utopian terms here, you might be able to develop yourself in any number of ways that we haven't even been thinking of, not just arts or sciences or explorations or something, all this. Like right now, this gets reduced to, oh, I have a little time left after my work. And so I think I'll take a free course on basket weaving or, pottery or something like that. And maybe you'll enjoy that. But it's just this kind of dinky little thing that's crammed in some slot. You have an hour to do that, and then you got to get back to work or get back to taking care of this or that. So I think that's good enough. Kirsty, unmute yourself, please.
Yeah, no, I'm finding this chapter really like the previous one really interesting. And just, I mean, this kind of like the way capitalism is sort of continually expanding and like just like the enclosure movement on a physical level. It's sort of like this is the enclosure of our perception of time. And I mean, it's just the whole thing is kind of making me, I mean, it's a little disheartening because it makes me wonder at like Debord's sort of optimism that the proletariat can at some point become conscious and actually take history into their own hands. But this sort of level of invasiveness into the psyches of people to the point of something that we basically experience so much as like physical, just the nature of reality. Although certainly if you read about other cultures, they had very different perceptions of time, like Native Americans and so on. And people, as different languages even show some bits of that left. But the other thing I was finding interesting about the previous thing, the thesis on the Renaissance, it's like he's talking about, that seemed to me to be like a illustration of what he's talking about as real life that he wants to return, because this irreversible time, he keeps mentioning it, unlike cyclical time, with irreversible time, it's about accumulation. So mostly it's like the accumulation that we see in capitalism, but here it's like accumulation of knowledge and people really kind of living this actual life for a moment, but then, I'm kind of
The
curious from
exuberant
Debord's
life
point
of
of view, what is it? Is it just inevitable in the, I don't know, whatever political economic structures that this spring of life will be so brief and the bourgeoisie will, flourish in this same, environment that allowed some freedom?
Well, I think that one of my friends, Daniel Denevere, used to know Debord for a while, and then they had a split and so on. But one time he said something about, what about some of these previous periods? Have we lost a lot? And Debord said, well, in Society the Spectacle, I mentioned the 2 or 3 points where there was some life there, but looking at it, all things considered, we haven't lost much. I think he meant like ancient Greece, Renaissance Italy. Obviously there are little bits here and there, otherwise, but these are just little spots, in the midst of a pretty miserable history, human history. Most of it has not been that. I mean, maybe you don't need to make it so gloomy. I mean, within those things, there's probably no society that hasn't had some fun in it. But with most societies that we think of, it's been mostly work or suffering or battles or, starvation and these different things. And so when he's running through history like this, I think he'll just point to those things and say, this is a hint of what, like he later wrote a thing touching back on the Society of the Spectacle, and he said, nobody who's read this book carefully thinks that it guarantees anything, that we're going to come to a utopia. You know, if people are going to be passive or something, you know, you make your bed and you lay on it, kind of thing. But if, you know, we can do, I mean, there are these potentials there. There's no question about that. And I don't think there is any question. If we get beyond that, it's not like we're arriving at a plateau and then everything is hunky-dory. It's what the way that Debord he says something like endless struggle, endless conflict. But if we can get over capitalism, he's looking at that endless conflict kind of the same way that Blake did, where he said generous contention. He's imagining a society where, yeah, there's going to be differences, viva differences, all sorts of things here. You know, we don't know what's coming, but we will have gotten, when I wrote Joy of Revolution, I have my last chapter I called More Interesting Problems. And I said, we're not guaranteed to have end problems, but let's end stupid problems, like having people starve to death or deciding whether to go to war or not, or I mean, or who to vote for between two bozos or something. Those are stupid problems, you know, that we happen to be stuck with right now. But interesting problems is once we get rid of that, then what do we do? And there's no guarantee, like if you're a boring person, you'll still be a boring person, maybe, you know, or if you don't, you know, there will, but the way he defines it as a sort of a phrase that he throws in, he says, at that new society, it'll be like an Athens or a Florence in which no one is left out. Because if you look at those two examples, the problem is they're both very inspiring examples, but you say, well, what about the servants or the slaves? Or you know, like you are seeing large segments of people have very interesting lives. And Debord is just saying we can have interesting lives, but not based on the fact that we're leaving 95% of the people out of it. And it doesn't have to be that way. So I think he's just pointing to those things, and that maybe that's his personality, that he kind of savors that or something, you know. But however, the thing, he's looking at life as a game, and he wants interesting games, not a dumb game like, you know, how can you overthrow this thing? You know, those are the games that we have to play. But there can be more interesting games like what do you know, and then I kind of speculate in Joy of Revolution, like what would that be like, you know, like you know, would we do spiritual things or have orgies or yeah, you know, and my conclusion is that there would be this abundance of different things and people would sort of be wandering in among them and all that. I'll come back to that, but I think I want to get on to other people, but thanks for bringing that up. Peter.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting the way he describes how we experience time in capitalism. That commodity time, spectacular time he's talking about. He's really using what Marx has to say, the need of capitalists to measure socially necessary labor time. When we're producers or workers, we experience it as kind of discrete periods of time where we're making stuff so they can the bourgeoisie can measure exactly how much we're making and how much it's worth. But then when we're outside of that, like you said, we're consuming stuff, we see the pseudo-cyclical time, right? So we're kind of getting this two ways that we view things. When we're at work, it's really annoying and it's like, and we just have to get to the end of the workday. But then, hey, NFL season started again, and then the summer blockbusters are coming out, and it's Christmas again, and here comes all this stuff. But it's all disjointed, it's all flattened, and it all seems like the same. And what strikes me is, he's kind of begging the question what time would look like after capitalism, because he says in 145, he says, what appears the world over as the same day is merely the time of economic production, time cut up into equal abstract fragments. I mean, what would it look like if we didn't have that kind of capitalism and we had socialism or communism? I mean, we would all have different time, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
which,
Well, I'm
yeah,
going to jump
fascinating.
ahead. I'm going to jump ahead to number 163, and we'll get to that more. But he says the revolutionary project of a classless society, of an all-embracing historical life, implies the withering away of the social measurement of time in favor of a federation of independent times, a federation of playful individual and collective forms of irreversible time that are simultaneously present. So again, that, it's just like one sentence, but it's an ingenious thing. He's sort of determining the thing of withering away of the state and the anarchist thing about federating things instead of a central federating different communities. Well, you federate different times.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's like you could, here in New York or whatever it would be, we would have one way of thinking of things, and then out in California you'd have another or whatever. But we all still see each other in that kind of irreversible way. Just it's very, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Mike, unmute yourself. You're still muted.
About that. Yeah, I just wanted to, the perception of time, I think, is very important, and the pseudo-cyclical time is a perception of time based on power relations, and the power of the working class is basically flows into the consumption aspect as opposed to the production aspect. In other words, it's a question of power. When we control our time, as opposed to just selling it, we can make our own history, and we can enjoy ourselves, and we can enjoy each other, and we can enjoy our time. Whereas now in pseudo-cyclical time, all we can do is buy our time, and we can buy it as a commodity in certain little clips and all of that. So I think the perception of time. Now, the question of whether this can actually occur or not has to do with desire for power to control your time, to control the wealth that you produce. And that is absent. That seems to be absent. And that's the fundamental question. Can the proletariat actually possess their own time and enjoy their lives?
Yeah, that's the question.
Thank you. Yes, that is the question. Dan, unmute yourself, please.
Yeah, so this might be a bit of a tangent, but it's inspired by, these sections. And so I'm just thinking about how a certain form of commodified time, but in a sense, longer than, a day, a week, or even a year. So the idea of a generation, it's kind of a minor obsession of mine to wonder about why this conception is so popular now. Even or especially amongst like the most intelligent people, sort of in cultural criticism, even people, who would love Debord, they seem to latch onto this idea of a generation and interpret reality in terms of it. And the specific passages here that make me think of it. So a generation is, I guess, originally understood as like a biological thing, so you have the parents, the children, their children. So these are the generations. And then it's it's been sort of transferred to a societal phenomenon, which has some use, but it's the thing that strikes me is that it's less and less the case that, well, I think they used to measure generations as sort of like a quarter century, right? Because that was like the average time when people would reproduce, as parents, right? So, but as the sort of like the first age of becoming a parent gets older and older, the generations, as we understand them, get smaller and smaller, and they seem increasingly just purely, marketing phenomena, right? And so in passage 150, where he talks about how these sort of new variants of time, they harken back to or echo these old cyclical rhythms. It seems to me directly applicable to this, and it seems like utterly commodified time. So I wonder if anyone else had any reflections on that.
I'm going to indulge myself here. I've mentioned the Joy of Revolution, which is the first text in this book. It's kind of a short book in itself. And I don't know how many of you have read Joy of Revolution? Okay, a few. It's in 4 chapters, and the first chapter is sort of introductory. The second chapter is looking at revolution or radical change from in so-called ordinary situations. Like, what do you do? Just what would we do right now? Do you vote, or do you have a union, or do you do this? And then the third chapter is radical situations, like these exceptional times, like the free speech movement or May 68 or the Occupy movement or something, where something just kind of comes in and suddenly the usual things don't apply anymore. People are questioning things and they say, oh, wait a minute, we could do things, move real fast. And then the last chapter, the 4th chapter, is I say, well, okay, we're looking at these different tactics and what works and what all that, but let's just suppose that we won. We had a global revolution of the sort of thing I'm talking about, and there isn't capitalism anymore. There's no civil war. The enemies have been defeated. The states have collapsed, and whatever. Then how would it be? And I have these different things that doesn't answer, responds to these frequent questions. People would say, well, what would you do if you didn't have money? Or if you didn't have police, what would you do if somebody did this and whatever? So I go into a lot of these different issues, like how people have done stuff and how they might do it. And then I get to the very end of the book, the last 3 pages. And the little title of that section is called More Interesting Problems. And I'm just going to read that to you. An anti-hierarchical revolution will not solve all of our problems. It will simply eliminate some of the anachronistic ones, freeing us to tackle more interesting problems. If the present text seems to neglect the spiritual aspects of life, in quotes, this is because I wanted to stress some basic material matters that are often overlooked. But these material matters are only the framework. A liberated society will be based far more on joy and love and spontaneous generosity than on rigid rules or egoistic calculations. We can probably get a more vivid sense of what it might be like from visionaries like Blake or Whitman than from pedantic debates about economic credits and recallable delegates. I suspect that once people's basic material needs are generously taken care of, and they no longer are subjected to a constant barrage of commercial titillation. Most of them, after brief binges of overindulgence in things they were previously deprived of, will find the greatest satisfaction in relatively simple and uncluttered lifestyles. The erotic and gustatory arts will undoubtedly be enriched in many ways, but simply as facets of full, rounded lives that also include a wide range of intellectual, aesthetic, and spiritual pursuits. Education, no longer limited to conditioning young people for a narrow role in an irrational economy, will become an enthusiastic lifelong activity. In addition to whatever formal educational institutions there may still be, people will have instant access via books and computers to information on any subject they wish to explore, and they'll be able to get hands-on experience in all sorts of arts and skills, or to seek out anyone for personal instruction or discussion, like the ancient Greek philosophers debating in the public marketplace, or the medieval Chinese monks wandering the mountains in search of the most inspiring Zen master. The aspects of religion that now serve as mere psychological escapes from social alienation will fade away, but the basic questions that have found more or less distorted expression in religion will remain. There will still be pains and losses, tragedies and frustrations. People will still face sickness, old age, and death. And in the process of trying to figure out what, if anything, it all means and how to deal with it, some of them will rediscover what Aldous Huxley in the Perennial Philosophy refers to as the highest common factor of human consciousness. It's kind of a mystical consciousness. Others may cultivate exquisite aesthetic sensibilities like the characters in Murasaki's Tale of Genji, or develop elaborate metacultural genres like the glass bead games in Hermann Hesse's novel, freed from the material limits that formerly confined such pursuits to narrow elites. I like to think that as these diverse pursuits are alternated, combined, and developed, there will be a general tendency toward the personal reintegration envisioned by Blake, and toward the genuine I-thou relations envisioned by Martin Buber. A permanent spiritual revolution in which joyous communion does not preclude rich diversity and generous contention. That's a quote from Blake. Leaves of Grass, Whitman's wishful thinking about the potentialities of the America of his day, perhaps comes as close as anything to conveying the expansive state of mind of such communities of fulfilled men and women, ecstatically working and playing, loving and loitering, strolling down the never-ending open road. With the proliferation of continually developing and mutating cultures, travel could once again become an unpredictable adventure. The traveler could, quote, see the cities and learn the ways of many different peoples, unquote, without the dangers and disappointments faced by the wanderers and explorers of the past. Drifting from scene to scene, from encounter to encounter, but occasionally stopping like those barely visible human figures in Chinese landscape paintings, just to gaze into the immensity, realizing that all our doings and sayings are just ripples on the surface of a vast, unfathomable universe. These are just a few hints. We aren't limited to radical sources of inspiration. All sorts of creative spirits of the past have manifested or envisioned some of our almost unlimited possibilities. We can draw on any of them as long as we take care to extricate the relevant aspects from their original alienated context. The greatest works do not so much tell us something new as remind us of things we have forgotten. We all have intimations of what life can be like at its richest. Memories from early childhood when experiences were still fresh and unrepressed, but also occasional later moments of love or camaraderie or enthusiastic creativity. Times when we can't wait to get up in the morning to continue some project or simply to see what the new day will bring. Extrapolating from these moments probably gives the best idea of what the whole world could be like. A world as Whitman envisages it, this is a quote from Whitman, a world where the men and women think lightly of the laws, where the slave ceases and the master of slaves ceases, where the populace rise at once against the never-ending audacity of elected persons, where children are taught to be laws to themselves and to depend on themselves, where equanimity is illustrated in affairs, where speculations on the soul are encouraged, where women walk in public processions in the streets the same as the men, where they enter the public assembly and take places the same as the men. The main shapes arise, shapes of democracy total, result of centuries, shapes ever projecting other shapes, shapes of turbulent manly cities, shapes of the friends and home givers of the whole earth, shapes bracing the earth and braced with the whole earth. End. So I think of some of those things with some of the questions or comments that have come up here. And I think we'll have some of the same things in the next chapter where they talk about the territorial things. It's the same idea. I think there's this huge potential here. I mean, there's no question that people could do that, but we have to approach it not like a utopian thing, like just to say, well, here's how it should be, and then try to sign up people to do that. We have to realize, like Marx and Debord and these people, like you have to look at where we are now and say, there's that vision is a real thing. And it's, I think we can see that in us. We see it around us to some extent, but we also have to realize all the things that block that now and see like why aren't we there? Well, there are certain there are people that that don't want to go there. There are people that would like to go there, but they can't conceive it because they're so repressed, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where the turmoil is, to figure out what strategy would work to advance towards that or something like that. But I think that utopian element is important, to keep in mind. Like one of the earliest things the Situationists said was that they wanted to kind of publicize the disconnect between the possibilities and the realities. Yeah. So we have these new technologies, we have all this and that. These could foster that, but instead they're used to foster, how can we sell more things, or how can we defeat the enemy in a war, or something, all these stupid things. But if people can be made aware of this is possible, like that famous saying was, another world is possible. If you have somebody to know that another world is possible, you can't just argue it. You have to feel it in yourself to some extent. And that's why revolutions, don't move mechanically. They sort of just bubble up sometimes and then, whoa, wow, yeah, things could be different. But most of the time, there's also this habit, these things that kind of bring it back. Oh, I guess we have to go back to work. It's simpler that way. I don't want to have to think about all this complicated stuff. So that's the turmoil that we're living in, but it's definitely a possible thing. And every once in a while, like, where did the Occupy movement come from? I don't know. Who can say? Nobody predicted that. Where did May 68 come from? Nobody predicted it. So the things are possible. And so then the thing is, how can you take those possible things that do crop up and extend them? And that's why you remember in the Debord film, at the very end of the film, he says, we're going to need several things like May 68. You can't just have a May 68 and expect everybody, the people that made May 68 didn't know what they were doing. And so they're going to look around and start being kind of afraid and, oh, let's go back to work. Or it takes a little while before you can kind of get it in your guts. Oh, it could be different. That was part of the reason the 60s were so volatile, is that there were millions of people who were living differently at a certain point, that they weren't living non-capitalistically or something. I don't want to say that, but they had enough free, joyous kind of adventures that somebody couldn't just say, oh, that's impossible. They said, it's impossible. We can get along,
Yeah.
And so if people go through those things, the key thing is it's sort of a matter of timing. Like if you have something and then it recedes, but then you have something else, well, those same people can remember it, uh, maybe you can pick up, and have something 10 years later where the people say, oh, I remember what we did last time and it didn't work. We've got to remember to do this while there's time. So that's kind of the stuff that all this is about. It's how do we get from here to there, but acknowledging the fact that we're stuck in this ridiculous network, this machine.
Do you think it's a tendency, if we got in that state, to move out of it?
Well, there's a tendency, if we're not used to it, and then we sort of fluke into a joyous week like May or something like that, then people do kind of freak out because they're not yet, they don't, oh, wait a minute, who's in control here? What's, and so habit may bring them back, like, well, it's easier if somebody just tells us what to do, it's more complicated. It's also a lot more fun if we figure out what to do and all that. But there's an easy habitual thing that brings people back. I mean, it's like we've been addicted to stuff all our lives. And so if we have a few days off, it doesn't mean that addiction goes away. Yes, Sid, unmute yourself.
So maybe like most other things, it requires practice.
Yeah, and some luck.
Some luck, yeah.
I mean, practice includes, even these things that were like these military strategists like Clausewitz and so on, they would be the first to say that you don't just have formulas for how you conduct a war or a battle or something like that. You also have to have a sense of like taking advantage of a quick fluke that comes in.
Mm-hmm.
Or guessing well because you can't tell what the enemy is doing or something. So there's an element of uncertainty in all this. All we can do is try to find some things like this does not work. Forget that. This looks promising. Let's try that. That's what happened in May 68. It's
There might be little things to practice too. Like I'm enjoying like doing Tai Chi now, and there's certain parts of that sort of remind me of what you just said. Stuff works, some other stuff doesn't work, and so
yeah.
Some people I've played Wei Chi or Go a couple of times, and that was some people like that. It's sort of like a game that could be, what's the word, like,
Expanded on, or
yeah, a game that could be expanded on, or just something to keep you conscious of that, you could, this the kind of stuff happens in the world too. It's like an example. It's a small thing, right? But it's not this major thing where you have this conflagration. But unless we take what we're doing now, somehow or other, I have this idea that, we could talk till we're blue in the face, right? And this thing happens, and then more likely than not, we're just not ready, right?
that's right. That's right.
Right. So how do we get ready?
Well, that's another thing that why the Situationists are somewhat different than most other radical groups is that they were coming out of things like Dadaism and Surrealism, and not coming out of just sort of a drab thing like help the oppressed, or it was like there were movements that had to do with imagination, individuals experimenting and uh, questioning the whole system and all this kind of thing, and including just their own immediate life. And so when that early Situationist slogan came up, boredom is counter-revolutionary, most radical things would say, well, wait a minute, how can you say that? It's sometimes you've got to, get down and do these hard things and, send out things to tell people to vote, or to, it may be boring stuff, but that has to be done. But the Situationists were saying that, yeah, okay, granted, yeah, sometimes you do have stuff like that. But in general, if you're doing something boring and alienated, it's not going to have unalienated results. You're just, and the same thing that they said about political groups. They said if you have a group that even if it has accurate ideas about how the society works or something, if the group itself is hierarchical, it's just reproducing that society. You're getting people used to either politicking so you can be at the top, or being the servant of the people at the top to tell you what to do. And, so you're kind of reproducing the society just because, so
how would they feel? So would they be in favor of collectives? I would say, like, we had fairly recently in this country, we had some sort of medium minor collective movement that was trying to practice not being hierarchical.
Right. But that has some problems too, because if you try to do that within an alienated society, there's only so much you can do. For example, if you have a workers' co-op, your workers' co-op has to function like a capitalist thing.
Like a business almost.
That's right. If there's a co-op bakery in Berkeley or something, and I don't know the details of how they work, but they have to compete with non-co-op bakeries. If they make crappy bread, nobody's going to buy it. If they have too much, if they have meetings 24/7 or something, everybody just gets burned out and wants to go away. So you have to judge, like, which are these things. I mean, I think those things are interesting, but also people can get disillusioned, get discouraged, because they think, oh gosh, that's such a headache. We had to argue with so and so about should we pay the rent for the new building, or and so's bookkeeping wasn't very good, and so now
Right, but those are going to be sort of, even though it's not exactly the analogous, they're going to be similar kind of things, right? When you have a council, I mean,
that's right. So you do have to learn these
deal with
cooperative sorts of things. But the idea with workers' councils is that once they're sort of underway, where if you have, the majority of the society under their control, then you don't have to operate like a capitalist thing. You can make decisions collectively that are not for profit, that are for the well-being of the community or for the well-being of the workers, or all this kind of thing. But if we were just to say right now, well, what can we do? I mean, there are people, like I say, there are co-ops in Berkeley and various places, and
Yeah.
you go there, and it is a little different. I mean, if I had to work for something, I mean, you even see when they're working there, there's a little more verve to it, is my sense. But I'm also sure, I mean, I've heard, yeah, that people do get burned out,
Mhm.
because there's meetings all the time, or so. Yeah, I mean, it kind of depends on how you do it. It's not easy. You can't
No,
say, oh, this is going to be hunky-dory because we're all going to share everything. Well, you're going to share maybe among yourselves, but you're not going to share with the person out on the street. So
right.
what are you going to do with some homeless people want to move in, or if the tax collectors come, or there's all kinds of problems. I mean, a lot of times they're in a neighborhood where everybody's going to get mugged or something.
Yes.
You can't do all these lovey-dovey things, without, how are you going to deal with that?
Yeah, messy.
So messy. I mean, you have things where you'd have to call the police because somebody's getting murdered or something. Yeah, you can't just isolate yourself and say we're going to do this thing here and wall out the rest of the world. The rest of the world is going to refuse to be walled out, for one thing, and even the people in it, in it just would not. I'm not knocking this. I'm just saying you have to
No, I think you're
understand.
bringing up some really excellent
Yeah,
points.
you have to understand. I mean, I could say equally, if not more, things about working in a non-co-op environment, which is what most people do. Or
Right. Right. That's like it's kind of a brain tease, like like you said, it's like sometimes it's easier to just say, oh, fuck, let's just let the boss tell me what to do,
yeah,
and I can relax and not think, and then, right, have energy to go and play after
yeah.
work or whatever,
And
right?
and there are some bosses and some companies where that would be true. I mean, you'd be crazy not to, like, here's a good boss, he's paying you well, he's taking the responsibility, you don't have to think about,
Right.
it depends on the situations, but just in general, we don't like the idea like the hierarchies are going to reproduce hierarchies.
Hmm.
So when you're talking about your Tai Chi or your Qigong or whatever it was, and these other things, I mean, I think that's fine too. But once again, you can't assume that's going to solve everything. But it may be that for a particular person at a particular time, that may be just what the doctor ordered. Oh man, I was a wreck, and now I'm not drinking so much and I'm enjoying my food more, or I'm a nicer person since I've relaxed, or
Right.
these things. I mean, and it can be various things that do that. Sometimes religions do that. I mean, there are people practicing very ugly, stupid religions that get good stuff out of it. They become nice people because, they're leaving it all to Jesus or so, whatever. So I don't want to privilege, it doesn't have to be Buddhist or this. That's
Right.
just, it's an example that personal things can be helpful, but they also, all of them have their limits. And so it's just, I mean, if you have nothing else to do, okay, do Zen meditation or do Tai Chi or do this or that, yoga or something. And that might be a generally good idea, but for certain circumstances, it might not be such a great idea. It might just make you more pain in the ass. You're more pretentious. You're going around saying, well, I'm liberated. I'm like, oh, yeah, so all those things can factor in. but it's just that if we look at the ensemble, and that's what Debord is doing, but he's looking at the ensemble, not just the ensemble, he knows those specific things, including the arts, like individual exploration, individual relationships, with all these different kinds of things. And they're not rejected, like many leftist groups kind of reject a lot of that. So they say, oh, that's bullshit. That's just creating illusions for people and all that's, and in a way, they're just as deluded themselves, like, because they're not recognizing what's going on in their own lives, maybe. But I'm just saying that there's no quick fix.
Right.
And we're surrounded by quick fixes, get this brand, get this religion, this kind of psychotherapy, this sort of thing. And in many cases, they have some helpful things for some people some of the time and all that. So you can't knock it, it's not totally nonsense, but you still have to the whole system is not going away just because
Right.
I personally am living a fairly tranquil life or something. And
Yeah.
so
What's the relationship between those practices and, change?
that's right. That's right. So you have to, and that's debatable. And people will still say, oh, no, you can't do that. That's, uh, and they may even be right, but it just depends. I just want to say, and I think one of the things I like about the Situationists is that although they may seem rather harsh in some way, like, merciless in some regards,
Yeah.
there's also a whole lot of things that they don't talk about because it doesn't matter. You can debate, should you do Tai Chi or do psychoanalysis or, they don't write an article about which is better or worse of those things or something. They try to focus on the things that are, that make a difference, the sort of pivotal things, you might say. And a pivotal thing would be that, oh, yeah, there's a lot of radical stuff going on for decades and decades. And it's hard to find your way through all the morass. But after a certain point, you can come through and say, aha, I have figured out Stalinism is not it.
Right.
You can come to a very global conclusion after a certain number of things. Whereas if it's some other issue, you say, well, what about this? Well, that's still, there's some wiggle room there. You can't just make it easy. You can say something like Stalinism must be destroyed. That like, easy. And there are some things like that. You can say we have to abolish capitalism, wage labor, something like this. But those are such large things that can also be abstract. That it's like, it's just abstract, like saying, well, if everybody was nice, we wouldn't have any problems. Absolutely true. Because if everybody was nice, even if somebody had money, whatever that would mean, he wouldn't abuse it. He'd give it to people and, but that's not how it works. So
Right.
then we have to say, well, how it actually works is that even if there are nice people that are up at the top or something, there's something wrong with the system and we need to do something about that. And there are certain nuts and bolts about that. And you can say things like wage labor, no state, no blah, blah, blah. There's a few things that you can argue with pretty specifically. But a lot of these things, once it's in practice, it's not so easy. You can say, oh, the unions do this. Well, what about the Solidarity Union? That's kind of different. What about the IWW? Well, is that really a union or is there, there's things where these things merge into workers' councils or workers' councils merge into something stupid. you know, so you just take these things, these phrases and concepts are just tools that you try to work with, and you have to be aware that that tool can turn into an enemy. You know, something that was very useful at one time is an obstacle later on. Mike, unmute yourself, please.
Yeah. Just a point about a cyclical time. During cyclical time, the things that kept people from revolting and so forth and so on were a lot of those abstractions that have to do with religion and the whole reversal of the subject-object relationship in terms of power. For instance, you could think you were miserable because it was God's will, or you had sinned, and you could go to church and get confession, and you'd be forgiven, and possibly you would never die. You would go to heaven, and that maintained a kind of stability of perception of time. And then you get the irreversible time of the bourgeoisie, and you start realizing that you might actually cark it and not ever do anything other than compose or decompose. Then you're in this situation of pseudo-cyclical time, and a lot of what maintains pseudo-cyclical time in my humble opinion is for instance, the psychotherapeutic industry, where you go and you confess your sins to a guy for $600 an hour, and then he tells you, well, you're a little bit off the rails, and I'm going to put you back on the rails and everything. In other words, your sins will be forgiven, and you will eventually, after innumerable sessions, you will come out and be well adjusted. So you'll be well adjusted to what? Pseudo-cyclical time. And I think these sorts of adventures and idealism are, they're also, as you say, they're prominent also on the left. But, the idea that, the true leader of the revolution, Trotsky, would have made things different and everything would have turned out fine. It's the same sort of subject-object relationship where, the masses become the consumers as opposed to the producers. They don't produce that. They don't really control their lives. So anyway, I just wanted to say that there is such a thing as co-optation, and it goes on all the time.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, I see we're getting near the end here. Are there any other people, particularly anybody who hasn't spoken? But if not that, any of you who have spoken, feel free to have other questions and comments. Okay. Well, we have almost got to the end of the spectacular time, and there's so we'll definitely have that. And then there's another short chapter called Territorial Management, which is coming up next. So that will be our assignment. I'll send you out an email tomorrow, but we'll just keep continuing here. And thanks for your many questions and comments here. And I'll see you.
I just want to say, Ken, that I've had today a spectacular time.
You've had a spectacular time, indeed. Hey, there's nothing wrong with spectacles. They're fun. Again, you just there was one
Are you a spectacle enemy?
Situationist pamphlet, not the SI, but somebody that wrote back in the 1970 or something like that. And he said, bad mouthing of the commodities or something, and he sort of twisted it around and ended up like, for good commodities, salute. So you know, not to be a Puritan about this, but just to understand, you know, the problem with the commodities is not that they are things, but that they're commodified, that they're for sale, and et cetera. And that tends to make them sort of more alien or, you know, but there's lots of good things to consume. Nothing wrong with consuming. You know, that's what we do all our lives. But again,
are all
we just have to, you know, see the context, you know, like where this is getting out of hand and we want to do something about it. So anyway, thank you very much for your participation here. And I'll see you in a couple weeks, and I'll see some of you in next week for we have our literary group has the Burns session, which I'm looking forward to. Also, I've been having a lot of fun with. I might add the. I'm not sure if the Situationists, the new SI anthology has come out, but it's just about to. It's been at the printer for a few weeks, so it almost certainly will be out by the next time we're here. And this new Society of the Spectacle is already out. But you who already have it don't have to worry because there's not really all that much difference between the old and new editions. So again, thank you very much. And I'm going to stop our recording.